Hi, this is Darren with Philosophize Now. Do you want to be happier? Silly question. Of course you do. I've never heard anyone say they've been too happy lately. Well, today we look at a book by one of the most famous spiritual leaders, the Dalai Lama, as he tries to help us lead happier lives. This is The Art of Happiness by the Dalai Lama and Howard C. Cutler. This video is a review of the book and an in-depth summary. Please use the timestamps below to skip to the section you wish to watch. I've also created a short 5-minute summary which you can watch over here or through the link in the description below. Okay, so let's move on to the review of this book. Firstly, the positives. So this book uses a combination of both the Dalai Lama's views as well as scientific research to explain its concepts. Secondly, there's lots of information, and this information is kept both practical and simple by the author. And thirdly, the author challenges loftier ideas and doesn't just accept what the Dalai Lama has to say. And then the fourth one is good examples which help to reinforce the ideas. And finally, there are lots of meditations to help practice the concepts mentioned in the book. Okay, so let's look at the negatives of this book. Firstly, this book is not actually written by the Dalai Lama, but is a series of interviews with the Dalai Lama narrated and commented on by Howard Cutler, a psychiatrist. And secondly, this book is a difficult read. I personally struggled to finish this book as it had a very intellectual style of writing and the book felt very long. And thirdly, there's too much information. So good information is important, but when there's too much information, it can overwhelm the reader and make them unsure where to start. So for some readers, it will be a positive and others a negative. And then finally, oversimplification. Yeah, the author tries to make all concepts very simple to make them easier to understand. But some concepts lose their value when you simplify them. Okay, so would I recommend this book? Yes, but not for beginners. Because of the difficult read and all the concepts in this book, I think it might become daunting for beginners. Next, let's look at the summary of this book. This book contains 4 distinct sections. These are the purpose of life, human warmth and compassion, transforming suffering, and overcoming obstacles. So let's look at the purpose of life. In the first few pages of the book, the Dalai Lama says that the purpose of life is happiness, and no matter what an individual seeks, his ultimate goal is a better and happier life, and that happiness is achieved through training the mind. The term mind is a slightly different term than we use. It includes both the intellect and the emotions, as well as the mind. So firstly, we've got to understand the sources of happiness. The first step is to identify factors that create happiness and create suffering. Once you've found the factors that create happiness, you've got to cultivate these factors. These are things such as kindness, compassion, and friendship. And then identify the factors that create suffering, such as anger, hatred, and envy, and eliminate these factors. Next, we'll look at how happiness is determined by one's state of mind and not the actual events. So the author has a good example of a friend whose company got bought out by a larger company and no longer needed to work. After a few months, he talked to her again and asked her how she was doing. And she said that initially she felt great as she had bought a lot of new things, took a couple of overseas trips. After the initial excitement, she returned to the normal level of happiness she felt before. We can compare this to another patient who had received a diagnosis of being HIV positive. This initially devastated the patient, but after a few years, the patient reported that he now felt grateful for his diagnosis, as it made him appreciate every moment more than he did before. These examples, as well as many other studies, have shown that it's not the events that happen, but one's perception of the events that makes all the difference. Okay, thirdly, let's look at the comparing mind. So as humans, our mind likes to compare, and it does this in 2 ways. Firstly, it compares with the past. If you are better off than you were in the past, you will then be happier. For instance, if you previously earned $20,000 a year, and now you earn $30,000 a year, you will then be happier as you're in a better position. The second way it compares is with those around you. So if everyone around you drives fancier cars than you and lives in bigger houses than you, this will make you unhappy as you have less than them. But the Dalai Lama says that the trick is to compare yourself with those that have less than you. That way, you're always happy because you have more than those around you. Okay, so let's move on to the fourth aspect. This is using inner contentment to help balance desire. So what the Dalai Lama says is that desires can be based as positive or negative based on the outcomes they produce. And therefore, positive desires produce positive outcomes and negative desires produce negative outcomes. So how does one achieve inner contentment? There are two ways. Firstly, having everything we desire, and secondly, appreciating what we have. So what the Dalai Lama says here is that it is unlikely for us to have everything that we desire, because as soon as you achieve one of your desires, a new desire springs up, and this continues in an endless cycle. And therefore, it is much better to appreciate and desire what you already have, as then you can be happy and content in the moment. And then the fifth aspect is that we must know what true happiness really is. And true happiness is eliminating suffering. And this happiness is not based on outside factors, because outside factors are unstable and will change, and therefore when they change, your happiness will be lost. Next, let's look at training the mind for happiness. So the first step is to identify the effects of behaviors and emotions, and see how negative emotions harm us and positive emotions benefit us. Then the second step is the causal principle. And this is the relationship between events and emotions. And we have to practice increasing events which create happiness, such as compassion and kindness, and decrease the events which create unhappiness, such as anger, selfishness, and envy. We also have to remember here that the causal principle takes time to implement and will not be a short process. And thirdly, we got to review each day. Here we have to identify the positive and negative emotions that happen each day, and then make an effort to increase the positive events. Step 4. Self-discipline. Because this process takes time and requires daily effort, the individual needs to be self-disciplined to make sure they make progress. Next, let's look at the second section of this book, human warmth and compassion. The first aspect in this section is intimacy. So what is intimacy? The author describes intimacy as sharing one's innermost self with another and not holding anything back. So why would you want to create intimate relationships? Well, studies have shown that intimate relationships both promote well-being and counteract loneliness, and these are big problems nowadays. So let's look at a process for creating intimate relationships. This process works for any individual, whether it's a romantic partner, a friend, or a complete stranger. This process has 3 distinct steps. Firstly, establishing compassion. Here you have to understand how the other person is suffering, and then try and put yourself in their shoes and show that you care. The second part is respecting the other person's backgrounds and view. And the third part is being honest, open, and trying to find common ground. Next, let's look at the value of compassion. So compassion's literal definition means to suffer together. And why would you want to suffer with another individual? Well, studies have found that compassion improves physical and emotional well-being and is therefore a factor that leads to a happier life. The Dalai Lama goes on to split compassion into 2 types. The first type is the type you feel towards friends and family. This type includes an element of emotional attachment, as the feeling of compassion can change if they upset you. The second type is free from attachment and is based on the fact that all beings wish to be free from suffering, and can thus be felt for anyone, friend or foe. The second type is stronger, more reliable, and has a more profound quality, and is not based on outside events. To develop the second type of compassion, you need to regularly experience and understand other people's suffering. This means going to places where people suffer. Or the second option would be to follow the compassion meditation given in the book. Okay, so let's move on to the next section, transforming suffering. This section starts with a beautiful story around suffering from the Buddha's time. It involves a woman who suffered the death of her only child. Unable to accept it, she ran from person to person, seeking a medicine to bring her child back to life. One day she heard about the Buddha, who was said to have such a medicine. She found the Buddha and asked him for this medicine. He said that he knows of this medicine, but he needs certain ingredients. The woman was happy and said she would get whatever he needed. Bring me a handful of mustard seeds from a household where no child, spouse, parent, or servant has died. The woman agreed and began searching from house to house. At each house, people agreed to give her the seed, but when she asked if anyone had died, all the households had lost someone. One household had lost a daughter, another a husband. And after visiting many households, which had all lost someone, she realized she was not alone in her suffering, and was able to accept the death of her child. Next, let's look at ways to transform suffering. Firstly, we have to accept suffering as a natural part of life. Our suffering is a basic element that we share with all other living creatures. And you must realize this and that your view of suffering is important, as these will affect how much you suffer, as you saw in the story before. Secondly, we have to confront our problems and look for solutions. There are two types of problems that can occur. Firstly, solvable problems. These occur daily and we must try and find solutions to these problems. And secondly, unsolvable problems. These are things such as death, old age, and illness, and these cannot be solved, but we must still spend time thinking about them and try to accept that it could happen at any time. This will make it less of a shock when it actually does happen. And then thirdly, self-created suffering. We can sometimes cause unnecessary suffering by overreacting or taking things too personally. The author gives a good example, which I'm sure we've all experienced, of getting poor service when he was out for dinner with a friend. The friend took this personally and let it ruin the whole night, instead of just enjoying their time together. And then we also have to be aware of our own role in suffering, and sometimes realize how we are causing the suffering, and other times how it's out of our control. And finally, the author distinguishes between guilt and regret. Guilt is the unnecessary suffering, and regret is learning from one's mistakes. And fourthly, all things change, and one must be aware of this and try not to resist it, because resisting change creates suffering. You must also be aware that relationships change as well, and one must keep a supple mind which allows you to shift perspectives easily. This allows you to adapt to changing in relationships as well as in life. And fifthly, finding meaning in suffering. The Dalai Lama suggests two ways in which you can do this. Firstly, using suffering as a spiritual practice, and secondly, imagining your suffering is taking away someone else's suffering. Both these ways give purpose to your suffering and thus make it easier to bear. Next, we'll look at dealing with physical pain. Pain is essential to life, as the pain response acts as an important tool for learning, as the memory of painful experiences can help modify our behavior and ensures that the person will attend to the problem. Secondly, it gives us a sense of self. Patients with leprosy have no feeling in their hands and therefore see them as mere tools and not as part of themselves. And finally, understanding the purpose of pain can help us deal with it. I was fortunate to try this concept shortly after completing this book. I injured my finger and it was very painful. I tried thinking that the pain was only there to keep me from further injuring my finger and to be careful with it. I found this to be effective when the pain wasn't very severe, but when the pain was severe, it did not help me much. Let me know in the comments below if you've tried this technique and how it worked for you. And finally, freedom from suffering. In Buddhism, there are 3 root causes for suffering: ignorance, craving, and hatred. And eliminating these would eliminate most suffering. Okay, so let's move on to the 4th and final section of this book, overcoming obstacles. These obstacles are those specifically relating to negative emotions and behaviors. So how do you bring about change to these obstacles? Here, the Dalai Lama lays out a 3-step plan. The first step is education. Here you look at the reasons why you want to make the change, and you weigh up the positives and the negatives of making this change. Then the second step is determination and enthusiasm. Here you remind yourself why you wanted to make the change. You combine this with a long-term view to gain perspective, and combining this with your knowledge of your own impermanence can help develop a sense of urgency and enthusiasm to bring about the change. And the third and final step is action. Here you use habituation to help develop positive habits and reduce negative habits. And how you use this is to do constant effort over time, and that will create habits. The second way is to act in the manner you want to achieve. Studies have found that smiling and frowning stimulate hormones associated with the corresponding emotions such as happiness and sadness. And finally, realistic expectations. Be aware of the time needed to create change, and don't focus too much on your ultimate goals, as the slow progress might make you discouraged. Next, let's look at dealing with specific negative emotions. In Buddhism, one of the main ways to combat negative emotions is with their corresponding positive emotions. Let's look at a few examples. Firstly, dealing with anger and hatred. Here, the corresponding positive emotions is patience and tolerance. So when anger arises, take a time out and stop, and then analyze the situation. This is not an easy process, and at first you might not be able to stop, but over time you will develop this ability. But be careful here, this does not mean you let others do whatever they want to you. Sometimes you need to stand up to them, but do not stand up to them while you are angry. Secondly, dealing with anxiety and building self-esteem. Here the Dalai Lama distinguishes between two types of fears. Normal fears, these are fears of violence or fear of suffering, and these are normal and they can actually result in positive changes. The second type is abnormal fears. These are fears based on a wrong thought, such as fear of the dark as a child, or a general fear throughout the day of something going wrong. The Dalai Lama has a simple approach to fear and worry. He asks this question: can it be solved? If the answer is yes, then there's no need to worry about the problem, as it can be solved. But if the answer is no, and there's no way out, no solution, or no possibility of resolution, then there's no point in being worried about it anyway, as there's nothing you can do. When implementing this simple process, you will find yourself worrying from time to time, and just continue to remind yourself about these two facts. And finally, the Dalai Lama talks about using sincere motivation as an antidote to fear and anxiety. And the third specific emotion is self-hatred. Here the Dalai Lama says you should reflect on your own potential and all the potential things you can do and how intricate and amazing your existence is. And secondly, understanding his definition of love. What love is the wish for the lack of suffering and happiness of another. And everyone wishes for their own happiness and not to suffer. Therefore, everyone loves themselves. Okay, and finally, let's review the main concept in this book. Concept 1. The purpose of life is happiness. And then, happiness is achieved through training the mind and discipline. Thirdly, we talked about the value of intimacy and compassion. And then we went through how you transform suffering. Then we talked about bringing about change and specifically combating negative states of mind. Thanks for watching, and I look forward to seeing you in future videos.